Okay, welcome back everyone for the afternoon session. As yesterday, we start the afternoon with our Spotlight presentation part 2. So we'll have 8 presentations, same principle as yesterday, 3 minutes, 1 question, and then move on to the next speaker. And well, we'll start right away with the first speaker, and this is Claire Howlin from University College Dublin, and her presentation is entitled Visual Imagery and Music Listening Interventions for Pain. Please, Claire.
Thank you very much, Matt. Good afternoon, everybody. You're all welcome back. For those of you that don't know me, my name is Claire Howlin. I'm doing a PhD in University College Dublin in the Media and Entertainment Lab, looking at the cognitive principles underlying cognitive principles of music interventions. So I just want to kind of say a few words about the lab. It's kind of a multidisciplinary or multidimensional or multimodal lab. So we look at music, but also virtual reality, film, TV, reading, all these different types of entertainment, and kind of look at what are the cognitive principles that underlie them that are common and the ones that are different. So we find this a very helpful approach. So I'm both a cognitive psychologist and an experienced health professional, so I'm very interested in how music can change the way we feel, both physically and emotionally. Even more so, I'm really interested in how music can make us feel better. So we already know from meta-analysis that listening to music, even without a music therapist, can reduce the experience of pain, especially if music is self-selected by the listener. But what we don't know is, why does this actually happen? So my research asked the question, what are the cognitive principles underpinning music listening interventions in pain contexts? So to start to answer this question, because it's quite a big question, we have conducted a systematic literature review. So we've gone and found all the studies that have looked at music in a pain context, just listening, and we've qualitatively analysed those to kind of, in a systematic way, to get a lot of breadth out of the literature, but also a lot of depth. So we've found 75 papers that met the criteria, and this has helped us to find kind of what are people saying is happening, what are they actually testing, and this might give us kind of a starting point of how we can actually narrow this down a little bit. So in our preliminary findings, which is kind of what I'm presenting today, from one of the more deductive research questions, we have identified imagery as one of the several principles that are considered to mediate the benefits of music listening interventions, along with personal memories, musical experience, absorption, aesthetics, arousal, and the individual cognitive style of the listener. So there's a lot going on. You know, they're saying there's a lot of things that could be going on. And while a lot of studies mention these lovely topics, they often kind of fail to characterize it in any depth more than that, or actually try to isolate these components or test it in any particular way. So a lot of studies, while they're kind of identifying these as possibilities, there's still a lot of work that needs to be done before we could really verify whether this is the case. So I'd love to talk to you more about it at my poster, if you want to come down. And that's all from me.
Yeah, thanks very much, Claire. Are there any questions? Well, I have a question. You said you identified 75 papers that have used music to reduce pain. Is that correct? Are there also any papers that just use visual imagery or visual imagery to reduce pain?
I'd say there is, but this was very much a music-focused search. But very much so, they're kind of using control conditions. Some studies have used control conditions, whereby they might ask people to just listen to music or listen to music and might give them some guidance on imagery, but not so much that it's a full music therapy session. Or they might compare the music intervention with poetry or the symbolicism of poetry for the kind of to kind of use it the meaning rather than things that we would traditionally look at, like beats and tempo and things like that. So there has been some studies, and then another kind of approach in the studies is using audio-visual stimuli to begin with, so actually presenting people with images. Yeah. So a lot of stuff going on. Yeah. Yes.
Yeah, thank you very much.
Brilliant.
And our next speaker is Cheating C from Freie Universität Berlin. And his short presentation is entitled Figuration Under the Forces on the Rhythm in the Chinese Traditional Music. And just a second, because I need to turn on the sound for you. Okay.
Okay, thank you very much. And I'm actually now doing dance studies now, but my background is in musicology, so I'm interested in the body's sense of music, I mean in general. And the poster I'm presenting here is about the relation of the dynamics of the Chinese traditional Guqin and Nanguan music with the rhythm, which for me is quite different from the Western concept of rhythm. The term dynamics I'm using here does not indicate the gradation of loudness of music, but the different ways the musician use force while performing. And it is these different ways of using force that the ancient Chinese musicians often used the poetic figures to explain. For me, they reflect their mental images of the dynamics. For example, the dynamics of the tones of the lute are often described as the falling pearls, and the dynamics of the tone of the flute are described as the flowing water, and the technique of plucking the string of the ancient zither with the thumb is often described as a crane bird dancing in the startling wind. These images have also become the guiding images for the musicians to learn a proper way to use force while performing in order to bring forth the proper dynamics. As rhythm is not clearly indicated in the traditional music notation, the musician must develop the rhythm while performing through the dynamics that come from the different ways of using force. The rhythm is therefore more like a figure which is being continuously in figuration under these forces. In my research, based on the interpretation of the ancient treatises on music and the technique notes and instructions included in the ancient music scores, I analyzed these dynamics and also related them to the signs in I Ching, which is one of the most ancient prophetic script about the principle of the changes in the universe. And after some inspiring discussion at the conference, now actually I would like to rephrase a question I asked during the group discussion yesterday I found interesting. It's the question I found interesting but yet to be researched. And it is when a musician is using the guiding images to learn a proper way of using force while performing, how do we exactly know that the way of using force is actually changing? And moreover, do these images they are using while learning or performing also arouse more mental images of music? Perhaps the images, the relation of which has been developed throughout the history in the tradition of Chinese music and literature, and how to capture these changes. Although the time is limited, I think it is still worth listening to some Guqin and Nanguan music to have some idea about the dynamics and rhythm. So I'll play it. The first is Guqin music, the ancient zither music. Okay, and the second is Nanguan music, this one. Okay, thank you for the attention. I hope the music doesn't make you sleepy. I mean, thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, especially after lunch, it's a tricky thing. But I hope. Oh, sorry. I'm sure there are some questions, and we have time for one. Yeah, Maiko.
Thanks for your presentation. I was just curious, at the beginning you mentioned that you think the rhythm in the Chinese traditional music is different from rhythm in like the Western music.
Yes.
So in what kind of ways do you think it's different?
I think it is based on the musician's sense of force or the dynamics. For example, the Nanguan music we've just heard, the rhythm actually goes more like this. It's like 1, and then 2. I mean, so it's actually very slow. And how to explain this sense of being deferred? I mean, it's like the beat is always being delayed. And my argument in my research is that I think the sense of the dynamics, that is the sense of the force that the musicians are using while performing, is very important. Yes, so that is a brief description.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much. And our next presenter is André Ofner from the group of Sebastian Stober, who presented just before lunch. And he will be talking about reconstruction of Imagine music with a shared generative representation of musical concepts in EEG and audio.
Yeah. Thank you. So this will be the second teaser for this poster today. Luckily, now I'm already talking to deep learning experts after we heard the core ideas by Sebastian, so thanks for that. Here it is. So the basic 2 questions of this project are, can we use EEG to reconstruct music that is perceived or imagined directly from the signal? And can we use deep learning to maybe go a step further and use deep learning as a tool to model brain function and use those models to do the reconstruction? So here you see a very rough outline of how the experiment was set up. First, EEG was recorded. The second step would be then to do the analysis on the EEG signal itself. And on the right, you can see the 2 main intentions of the work, which would be the reconstruction itself in terms of reconstructing the Mel spectrograms of the signal, of the audio signal. And the other thing is to find a way to represent auditory concepts within the model. And the auditory concepts are within the network, so we can retrieve them from within the latent representation. So this framework is based on the autoencoder framework, which Sebastian presented some minutes ago. And so basically here the idea is to use convolutional neural networks to feed in the EEG signal and then at the same time reconstruct the EEG signal in the fashion of an autoencoder, but also reconstruct the music. And so another interesting idea here is to then add other encoders on the bottom. And these could be other EEG subjects. This could be perception versus imagination, but it could also be MRI data or affective data, facial data, things like that. We used 2 different data sets for that. The first one is the simple looped speech data set, but we also did first tests on a more complex data set of naturalistic pop music. But this was in the perception condition only. So what do the results look like? Roughly, we were successful in the sense that we do have some reconstructions, and they do seem to make sense musically as well. Sebastian already talked a bit about this, so I'm not going to go into details. But also, maybe interestingly, we also had quite interesting results on naturalistic music, so this model seems to work with complex music as well, and not just to these really restricted simple stimuli from the speech data set. So yeah, This is kind of a first approach to trying to look into the model, trying to understand if the model actually models something that is related functionally maybe to what the brain does. So ideally in the future we could base work on this approach and have more extensive, more introspective approaches to understanding how the brain works and reconstructing stimuli from the brain. Yeah. So if you're interested in how these things work in detail, feel free to ask me later. Thanks.
Yeah, thanks a lot. Are there any questions? Thomas.
Nice work. Can you play an example of the reconstruction? Yeah.
Sadly, no. We didn't really have the time yet to make audio out of the spectrograms, but that should be doable quite well. So far we really just focused on looking at the plots and trying to make sense out of it. Yeah, we like the most dominant thing is that we really start to reconstruct the timbre first. So this hints at that we actually need way more data because all of these data sets don't have so many different singers, things like that. And only then it gets interesting to also make audio out of it, I think.
And how do you evaluate whether a reconstruction is successful or not? What are the criteria?
So currently the model is trained using quite straightforward reconstruction loss, which basically treats these MEL spectrograms as images. So we basically just compare how similar these reconstructed images of MEL spectrograms are to those that we get from the audio directly. And then in the end we look at the fully trained models and look at them from a musical perspective, if they make sense. And so far at this stage of development, these things really go hand in hand. On the long run you would need better loss functions.
Yeah.
Makes sense.
Okay, would be really interested to hear it. Maybe then the next workshop
Sure.
can present some results.
Yeah.
Okay, thanks very much.
Thank you.
And our next speaker is Graziana Bresice from the University of Hull. And she will be talking about the influence of extra musical information on visual imagery in music listening. Please.
Thank you. Okay, so this is actually an extension of, those of you who were here last year, is an extension of the same project. However, this time I was also interested to look at whether extra musical information has an influence on visual imagery. So overall, the larger aim of the study was to explore continuous ratings of visual imagery and engagement with the music, so how this unfolds as we listen to an integral musical work, and to explore the content of the visual imagery. So with regards to extra musical information, when we listen to a piece of music, some work has been done on exploring the emotional effects of that piece when we are presented with some information, or how this information facilitates visualization tasks. So when a text is congruent to the music we are listening, making it easier to imagine that text. However, I was more interested in the more spontaneous use of visual imagery and whether having some information about the music influences how we would, let's say, more naturally respond in terms of visual imagery when we listen to that piece. So overall, the aims was to explore the content of the visual imagery in music listeners, but also to see how this information would influence the imagery created. So participants were around 40 participants, and there were two conditions in the experiment. So one listening was a free listening, no information provided about the music, and the other condition was a programmatic listening. So participants were presented with the title and a poem which was linked to each of the pieces. So for this reason, Free Movements from Rachmaninoff, Fantasy Tableau was selected, and these are actually, these poems are printed in the score, so they reflect what the composer's intention originally were. And these were recorded by me and another pianist. And so for the listening tasks, participants first heard the piece and rated, we were using a slider, continuous ratings of their visual imagery, and following that, they were free to make any annotations on a piece of paper to remind themselves of the imagery they experienced. So the outcome was quite interesting, and this is still in progress, so it's all just a preview for the moment being. But in terms of the imagery created, so 5 or 6 of the imagery, what are called the imagery routes, are presented in this poster. And by imagery route, I mean the way in which people reached their visual imagery. So for instance, the 6 presented in the poster are oral association, so an imagery created because we link through sound to another sound, for instance, a bird call. So by creating that link, we imagine a bird. Imagery, which involves an emotional content, so there's a link with emotions there. Material abstraction, which is focusing on a particular aspect of the music and creating an abstract image linked to it. For instance, imagine a line as a melody. Narratives being created, imagery which has a performance-related content, so imagining the pianist or the hands, and personal memory, so evoking past experiences. So when looking at these contents, the most prominent in the musicians group was actually, in both groups, was narrative. So it seems that creating narratives over music was quite a popular way of creating the visual imagery. The second most popular in the non-musicians group was actually imagery which linked to some emotional aspects, whilst for musicians, the second most popular group was performance-related imagery, and for the non-musicians, the third category related to recalls of past memories. And in the musicians, there were almost equally shared comments which visual imagery which linked to emotion and oral association. And you can see the rest of the details on the poster. However, it was very interesting to see when it comes to extra musical information that although we would expect people to imagine what they're presented with, this was not always the case. So sometimes people intentionally deviated from the content because they expressed wanting to assign a personal meaning to the music, so completely ignoring the poem they were presented with. And equally interesting was to notice how aspects which link to the musical, extra musical program still emerged in the group which had no information at all about the listening, about the pieces. So for instance, bird singing, which is a feature in the La Nuit, emerged very clearly even when they were not presented with the poem, or bells was actually a strong feature also in Easter Park, for again, even when they were not presented with any extra musical information. And also imagery which was congruent emerged slightly more present in the musicians group than the non-musicians. And however, you can see a bit more of the details on the posters, and thank you. I forgot to mention one thing, sorry.
Yeah, sure.
Just a last point. This is not in the poster, but it's part of the study, of the larger aim of the study. There was still a correlation which emerged between experiencing visual imagery and being engaged with the music, which was an interesting outcome, considering also the mind-wandering aspect, which has been discussed here, because whilst visual imagery can be considered part of mind-wandering and excluding ourselves from the external environment, this is actually another way of looking at it, so being more engaged with the music and whether this creates more experience of visual imagery. And that's it.
Okay, thank you. Are there any questions? Yeah, Claire's got a question.
I just have one small question. I was just wondering, how did you measure engagement, or how did you capture that?
So there were self-reports of engagement. So there was a definition being given to participants, and they would move the slider. So moving it up would be more engaged, and moving the slider down would be less engaged. So it was a continuous measure as they listened to the music.
Brilliant, thank you.
And did you also check the familiarity with the pieces? Were all the musicians equally familiar with them, or were there some non-musicians who knew the piece?
Yes, there. I did. This is not. These are other correlations, but there was not. It was not a strong. There weren't strong correlations in terms of imagery and familiarity, but I think that's also because most of the people were not familiar with the pieces, so there wasn't a spread enough variance of responses to measure, to look more detailed into that. But it's definitely something it's worth looking more into.
Yeah. Okay, thanks very much.
Thank you.
And we move on to Antonia Stella from Aalborg University, who will tell us about Tell Me What You See, an investigation on mental imagery evoked by music.
Hi. Okay. So, I've always been interested in the evocative power of music and how it can foster imagery in the audience mind. That's why with my musical project I started doing more and more long songs and instrumental songs, and I started using tools like live painting to build a base of imagery on top of which the audience could build their own. My more formal research started with Aalborg University. Here I selected 4 songs and I created a survey. In the survey, participants had to listen to a 2-minute extract of one of the 4 songs that was randomly assigned to them, and they had to answer a few questions, like if they knew the song or if they had some sort of imagery when listening to the song, and they were asked to describe the imagery they had. All the participants also had to choose 12 descriptive elements between these 35, and obviously they were told to choose those who in their mind were relatable with the music they heard. The results are very interesting. 77 participants completed the survey, which was online, and 52 of them said they experienced mental imagery. And the description given are very interesting if we consider the fact that most participants didn't know the song and didn't have any information about the title of the song or the artist or the album or the concept of the song itself. The songs were instrumental, so they didn't have any clue, but still the descriptions were very coherent with the concept of the album or the title of the song. And my favorite one is the first one, saying Archangels playing folk guitar in Texas French Incarnation of Heaven, because it's very similar to the description that Brian Eno gave to describe his song Deep Blue Day. And if you want to know more, just come to my poster.
Yeah, thank you very much for this presentation. Are there questions from the audience? Yeah, Aisha.
Hi. I was just wondering, the 4 songs that you used, was there a specific selection criteria for the songs you picked in terms of did they have to contain certain elements or properties?
Okay. No, not really. I mean, I personally chose the song because I thought they were not really new by people. All of them are instrumental, beside one of the 4 is not instrumental, but there's a super long instrumental part at the beginning, so I just took 2 minutes from that. And they are very different. So the criteria was that they shouldn't have been super known, and they should have been instrumental with different characteristics. So in one there's more synthesizers, in one there's more guitar, And so like they are very, like the imagery that in my opinion the imagery that could have that the song could have fostered would have been very different, and that's what happened.
Thank you.
And how did you choose these descriptive elements? Were there any relations to the songs?
Yeah, the same. Like I chose them like following my imagery of each of the song, and then I try to like keep them as general as possible, and give the option to describe almost every situation with the combination of them.
Okay, thanks very much.
Thank you.
And our next speaker is Thijs Vroeg from Max Planck Institute for Empirical Aesthetics, and he will be talking about investigating the directional link between music-induced visual imagery and two qualitatively different types of emotional responses. This already took now 10 seconds away from your presentation, but you get them back.
Thank you for that. So, one often cited source for the relationship between imagery and emotions is the probably well-known Brecfum model by Jocelyn and Viesvel. And what they basically propose is a number of mechanisms which are taken as causal mechanisms for the induction of emotion, which can be visually represented like this. And then last year's KOSMOS conference, Robina Day and Thompson presented evidence which actually pointed to the reverse. So that emotions is actually responsible for the induction of imagery. Then there's actually a third option, which would be the third option would be that there's a reciprocal effect. So that this reciprocity explains how imagery and felt emotions are causing each other or interrelated. So the first research question I addressed in my poster presentation is which model best represents the interrelationship between mental visual imagery and emotions. And I have to add to these three arrows that even a fourth possibility exists, and that would be that they are actually independent, so that there is no arrow at all. In order to address this interrelationship, there are a number of variables of importance, and one of them is the quality of emotion. Complex emotions like longing or nostalgia have been found to occur particularly with episodic memory rather than with visual imagery, whereas the opposite pattern emerged in case of pleasure or enjoyment responses. And these pleasure and enjoyment responses have to be understood in hedonic terms, so basically a feeling good kind of emotion. So in visual terms it would mean that the interrelationship between visual imagery and felt emotions might be different for different types of emotion. So the second question I addressed is whether positive hedonic emotions, such as feeling good, lead to other causal links with visual imagery than negative tinted and more complex, mixed or aesthetic emotions such as nostalgia or sadness. I used an online survey where I asked people to pick and choose to listen to a piece of music, and afterwards they had to fill in a number of items related to imagery and emotions. I had a sample of 602 people, which is quite a large sample because in order to test for reciprocity, for which I use structural equation modeling, you normally have to have a lot of you have to have a large sample in order to test whether there's actually reciprocity or not. As to the results, you're all cordially invited to take a look at my poster. I can already say that there is a difference between the hedonic emotion and the mixed emotions, where in the hedonic emotions there is actually indeed a reciprocity effect. In the mixed emotions there was an effect from imagery to emotions which slightly had a better fit compared to the other models. That's it.
Yeah, thanks very much. I'm especially glad to see that this seems to be research inspired by our last year's meeting, so I'm really happy about that. Yeah, any questions? Lila?
I just wanted to ask what type of music did you use, and also how did you assess the emotion?
Okay, so I had music from 5 different musical genres: classical music, pop music, rock music, dance and film music. And I basically let the participant choose within these 5 genres. They had the option to choose 1 of 4 musical pieces, and these differ in terms of valence and arousal. And I basically gave this option to choose the music themselves in order to have some sort of secured engagement, instead of giving only the option of listening to 1 piece of music. And the items for measuring emotions are items for the imagery. I used the PCI dimension of Becala, and for the hedonic positive emotions I had the pretty obvious items related to happiness, feeling good, being in a good mood, whereas the items for the mixed emotions were quite literally related to nostalgia, longing, also sadness was part of this battery, and bittersweet feeling. So these were supposed to tap into these more advanced mixed emotions.
And another question, yeah, Andre Herbst.
Thank you very much. I would like to know, how do you know that it was induced emotion and not perceived emotion?
Well, because of the phrasing of the items. So these items were phrased, while listening I felt happy. So it was pretty obvious that it concerned the feeling and not the perceived emotion in the music. Yeah.
Okay, thanks very much.
Yeah.
And the last speaker of our spotlight presentation, it is Dr. Miles Warrington from University of Pretoria, and his short talk is entitled Gestured Signification and Compositional Process, a model-based approach to mediation, technology development and creative ontologies.
Thank you. Afternoon. So this talk is really a summary of my poster here. It's from the composer's perspective when concerning musical imagery, mental imagery and or mind wandering and music. It considers that in the framework of the development of several models that outline different processes within a compositional task, that under certain conditions, such as the need to have mediation technology or technology developed to aid in the realizations of the compositional problem, that the models and compositional process follow a linear trajectory that are related, even though often compositional process is itself very often much non-linear. So as far as I know, there are 2 models, 2 ways of thinking about sound. The first one is one can imagine a phrase as part of the musical idea, first seen here, or you can imagine the sound itself and this is probably the more common way that occurs with composers. So I created this piece where each section of the work has been conceived as separate gestural images, evoking different intentions, affordances, feelings, or sensations. For example, walking, floating, ascending, descending, dancing, and so on. With the intention that, as Professor Godoy wrote, images of gestures seem to be efficient in evoking images of sounds. So that through a sound tracing process, the models become complete, and we can finalize the model here in the first instance of what I call gesture signification model A, or in the second case, gesture signification model B, which is the two different types of way of imagining the sound from a composer's perspective. When we combine these models, we have the possibility of a more complete gesture schema that can be used in many ways, but in this particular case, I used it for creating a mediation technology concerned with the stopping action portion of the excitation gestural unit of the left-hand fingertips of a violinist and its associated function in sound production. So finally, we can use or develop technology to assist in mediating certain properties of the gesture space and describe this in a mediation model as I have shown here. Essentially, as written there, the work attempts, as Hamann puts in describing Xenakis' use of technology in music, to projected musical thought in a technical experiment. The notion of compositional ideation can now be placed within a practical framework. So compositional ideation refers to thought or ontological process that starts with the identification of a compositional problem specific to the context of the thought at hand. In addition to the development of a gesture study schema as I've outlined and mediation models as I've shown, the composer creates organized musical gestalten in order to evoke impressions of motional dynamic gestures or openly intimate such gestures through melodic movement, rhythmic patterns, etc. In the focus of the notion of musical gestalt, it is necessary to reiterate that musical gesture is a cognitive phenomenon emerging in the mind in response to musical priming. And further, where it originates from the generic level of perception, where it is tied to gestalt perception, motor movement, and more importantly, mental imagery. So in summary, it becomes possible with this model-based approach to imagine sounds or shapes of sounds in an internal sound tracing process that involves gestural types and with mediation technology forms, enhance them, or create musical dialogue and further narrative around the images. Electroacoustic music lends itself to this kind of compositional practice because, as shown, you can control and manipulate certain musical parameters with the captured gestural information in real time. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Miles. Yeah, we have time for questions. Yeah, Henri again.
Thank you very much. I was wondering if you have any musical examples of what the composition sounded like.
Yes, I do. They're on the poster with QR codes. You can scan them.
Any other questions? We're ahead of schedule. Doesn't happen so often. I have one question regarding these the mental imagery. So I've seen, as we've seen throughout the whole workshop, this seems to be rather a multimodal phenomenon. Would you agree with that, or is it something that you can also confirm from a composer's perspective, that this is not something that's only in the visual domain or only in an auditory domain, but something that's multimodal?
Yes, and of course this research was necessarily subjective because, you know, to describe a compositional process as a composer and write about it, it was necessarily subjective, unfortunately, but, you know, supported by a lot of literature. So yes, it's multimodal, very much so. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Well, if there are no more pressing questions now, we move directly to our poster presentations. We have a bit more time for coffee and tea, and we meet again at 4 here for the group presentations. But first of all, enjoy the poster presentations. Thank you, and thank you to all the presenters of this session.